Christian nation is not possible.
Hitler hated Christ, got on here and said, dumb and wrong.
How do you make, I'm not supposed to ask a question, but
No,
I'm genuinely curious because many people would have used the language of a Christian nation.
It is so frustrating that it gets clipped out and it looks like Kevin DeYoung is in agreement. He's not. A Christian nation is not possible. Clip. Well, hold on. I just want to ask. I think I agree with you, but he pushes back. Why didn't you show that part? It's a bad look. It's a bad look.
So I believe that's the Christian politics.
Christian politics. So you can't have a Christian nation, but you can have Christian politics. So Hillsdale College interviewed Kevin DeYoung on, I don't really know what they talked about. Let's see what they talked about. Let's see how they introduced this. Oiki boiki boiki.
Hope we have a good time. I bet we will.
It is great to be here. Great to be at Hillsdale.
I hope we have a good time. Let's talk about this background.
The pillows are bigger than Kevin DeYoung.
That's because they're in the background.
I think it's smaller.
The pillows aren't bigger. You have pillows that are bigger than me.
Reformed and covenant. Those are two interesting things to me. I'm going to explore them a little bit because I want to understand more about John Calvin.
Okay.
That is why they did this. That's what the interview's about. But then it's labeled Covenant and American Founding. So they do talk about politics. But as you get to the interview and like the middle chunk, it's like a large chunk where they just talk about Calvinism. Things do get clipped out and they go viral. They go all over the internet and people get an impression. Oh, Kevin DeYoung went on Larry Arnn's show and they talked about American politics and Christianity. And that's not quite true. What you have is a philosophical type person who's interested in political theory. Like, he's interested in getting Kevin DeYoung's take precisely because he's a Calvinist. He's a Reformed person. So the first impression we need to have of this dialogue is that first and foremost, someone who is not Reformed, not a Calvinist, is getting one of the world's leading pop Calvinist pastors, Reformed pastors, respectable Reformed pastors on his show to discuss Calvinism. But politics don't come up in a way that intersects with the Calvinism discussion as much as it should. So then it feels like, well, what are we talking about? But I think in the opening you see that Dr. Arnn is primarily concerned about talking about John Calvin and Reformed theology. But there are really just three main sections I want to hone in on. I recommend that you go watch it. I think that he does DeYoung does a really good job defending Calvinism, and Reformed theology. But that's we're going to talk about how, failing to really bring Calvinism to bear on the political conversation, which made the interview feel kind of all over the place, is precisely what this interview lacked and why it felt all over the place. So we'll skip the Calvinism discussion proper in the conversation, and we're just going to focus on the on three important little spots where they talk about political theology. Larry Arnn, aren't you glad that DeYoung did this?
You're certainly right that in the Reformed tradition, it's not a straight line, but in the Westminster Confession, which are the standards for the Presbyterian Church, so it's from the 1640s, they are talking a lot about liberty of conscience and the rights of conscience. And you have Samuel Rutherford, who's one of the Scottish commissioners there. And of course, he writes Lex Rex, that the law is king. So he's undermining some of the divine right of kings. Not that everyone of the Westminster divines agreed on how to think of this. And in fact, one of the things that I've spent a lot of time in the last year or so, because there's a big debate about this among people in my tribe, is to see the difference.
Yes, there is.
Difference between the Presbyterians in the 1640s in London and then in the 1680s. Because when the American Presbyterian Church finally forms officially in 1788, they change the Westminster Confession, in large part in the article that has to do with the civil magistrate, because they want to move away from a kind of older European Christendom model where the civil magistrate suppresses heresies, punishes blasphemers, and they have more, and I think in a good way, a sense of civil liberty and religious liberty going hand in hand. And that's why
And you can thank the Baptists. Thank you very much. Can we get a background like that? You can say what you want about it, but that's just pretty. Let's watch the rest of it like this.
These are very powerful things in American history. The founding document of Hillsdale College is from 1844, and it begins, "The denomination of Christians known as Free Will Baptist, along with other friends of education." This, one of my teachers wrote a wonderful thing called "The Binding of Civil and Religious Freedom" as one of the greatest developments in human history.
So I just want to go ahead and pick up on something that DeYoung had just said about they were trying to get away from something that was older. The way that I have understood it is that power was primarily inherited by blood. So you have the king, and then the king has a son, and that king's son is the next king. We're willing to receive the theology from that time and not discount the theology on the basis of the fact that it came from a time that's not our time. And so, in other words, the time was legitimate. It was what it was. It's just a fact of history. But then when others want to say, hey, let's get back to that time, it's confusing for some people. If you're willing to accept the theology from that time, why, when someone comes along and says, well, let's actually reorganize in order to have the Christendom of that time or that hierarchical structure of that time, when someone like a DeYoung is going to push back and say, well, we don't want to actually go back to that time, the awkward, confusing question is, but you're willing to accept the theology that's come to us from that time, but you don't actually want their political theory. And that was the political theory that the theologians you love wrote in the context of and were willing to accept as normal. And I just want to say, I love, one of my favorite pieces of this entire conversation and the topics that I cover on this channel have to do with the revisions of the Westminster Confession of Faith in 1788. I love, and I know I made just like a little joke about like, oh, well, you can thank the Baptists, but like for real though, there was a mood in the West that the Baptists significantly contributed to, and that was a push for religious liberty. And I do think that those theological and social pressures did put Presbyterians in a spot where they had to say, in order for our faith to be able to transcend one political environment and exist in another political environment, we need to make some revisions regarding the civil magistrate.
there's important debates, as you know, with Locke.
Everybody needs to lock in.
Critical of Locke, thinking a lot of these problems are downstream from Locke. And one of the critiques is, now wait a minute, what about Romans 13? Paul says that you obey the governing authority.
Timon Klein and or Charles Haywood have pushed against John Locke as being helpful or useful. And if it's not them, I know that I have heard from Christian nationalist types or those on the far right have been very critical of figures like John Locke and chalk it up as simply just Enlightenment thinking. Also, I think on this note, it just kind of feels like, you know, there aren't any names, or if they do, it's very minimal, which I am going to say makes it more complicated once you get to the clip that went semi-viral, and Dr. Arnn says that a Christian nation is impossible. They haven't made very clear what a Christian nation is, and if it's the same thing as Christian nationalism. They haven't been very clear about the woke right or the new right or Christian nationalism up to this point, so it just kind of lumps Christian nation in with all of that.
And therefore, government must be able to frustrate the sinful inclinations of sinful human beings. So James Madison stays an extra year at Princeton to study with John Witherspoon, my guy. And I think John Witherspoon inculcates in Madison some of that Presbyterian anthropology, which shows up in Federalist 10, Federalist 51. We must have a government because we don't have angels to rule over us.
Ooh, that's very good.
That's a really beautiful line, and that's an idea put in the minds of men in the West that completely changes the way that we think about these things. And what I'm going to drive home at this point is that this is really the second section that I wanted to touch on, and that is where we start to talk about Calvinism a little bit, and we inch away from the political conversation and get into Calvinism, and then talk about Calvinism for a huge chunk. And I think that it would have been really cool to drive home that point that Dr. Arnn's concerns about Calvinism don't make sense with the fact that he loves the quote, "We can't have angels rule over us." It's the same idea, but Dr. Arnn, just how depraved do you think we are? He has an issue with the total aspect of it, or the predestination aspect of it.
And then the king is blamed for his perfidies, and one of them is he's messing with the other branches of government. And the lesson is only God could be trusted with all the powers of government.
Yeah.
And among men, they have to be divided.
Yeah.
How cool would it have been? I think DeYoung does a great job at defending Calvinism, but how cool would it have been when he talks about God's absolute sovereignty for DeYoung to be like, yes, because earlier what we said was only God can be trusted with all judgment and all government.
What do we mean? What is this predestination deal? Explain that.
Oh, well, gladly.
There you go. That's the Calvinism section. That takes up so much.
It's a
Okay.
good place to send your daughters to then, to Hillsdale.
Oh, yeah. They marry up and...
Uh-huh.
But do they have a singles pre-conference meeting?
If you're going to have a Savior who creates everything and is the only route to salvation, and he does not set up a kingdom, that implies a necessity of religious freedom. Does that seem true to you?
Yeah, I would affirm that.
So I believe that's the Christian politics.
Christian politics? Hold on.
That implies a necessity of religious freedom. Does that seem true to you?
Yeah, I would affirm that.
So I believe that's the Christian politics.
When
So you can't have a Christian nation, but you can have Christian politics.
You're just making up stuff, isn't it?
Can you have Christian... So is... But what he's saying is Christian politics is just religious liberty? So let's frame it in terms of upholding the table of the law. Upholding the Ten Commandments. Nearly everybody agrees that we should enforce the second table. How you enforce that, especially like adultery, how do you penalize adultery? But by and large, people are okay with the idea of enforcing the second table. I don't have a problem. Do you have a problem with that? They talked about it earlier, about the civil magistrate and blasphemy laws. And so that's an issue when it comes to citizenship. How do you define citizenship? So can citizens only be citizens on the basis of a profession of faith, a credible profession of faith? Who can rule? Are civil magistrates authorized and able to judge in matters of religious worship? Are civil magistrates required, therefore, to be Christians? And you can't have a civil magistrate who's not able to credibly profess the faith. So there are all those kinds of issues when it comes to upholding the first table of the law. So the issue is and so if framing it in terms of the first and second table of the law, what I hear Dr. Arnn saying is it's the Christian politics is the claim that we uphold the first table of the law politically by not enforcing it and maintaining religious liberty. But what about the second table of the law? And what does that look like? And can the emphasis be our nation is held accountable by God's law? Political controversy right now about putting the Ten Commandments in classrooms. What does Dr. Arnn think about that? Because if Christian politics, which again, he said a Christian nation is impossible, but then he said we can have Christian politics. So I don't have a problem saying that we can have a Christian nation, and I don't have a problem saying we can have Christian politics, but then if you say a Christian nation is impossible and then you define Christian politics as religious liberty, it just doesn't make much sense. Protecting politics from Christianity, is that what you said?
Yeah, something like that. That's how they act. Not actually like implementing it.
And this episode is brought to you by, so we can get the Cheerio on a rubber band.
Religious freedom, together with civil liberty, it's not Christians caving to other, well, I guess we can't have what we really want and what the Bible really tells us to do. Their genius was to say, this is not a capitulation of our Christian convictions. This is the fruit and the flowering of our Christian convictions. And maybe they had something mistaken in the 16th century and first part of the 17th when they thought the only way we can conceive of a polis is that we have a king or a prince or a magistrate who enforces one religion upon the people.
But that was the time that they lived in. It reminds me of Paul talking about slavery in the Bible. And the way that he spoke about it today, there are many people who would be uncomfortable using the language that Paul used, but Paul was using the language of his day. And so political theology, especially, I guess this further proves that political theology is a legitimate but secondary discipline. It's not, or a secondary category. It's not a primary issue. If you disagree on political issues, you're not a Christian. But it just goes to show how tricky these conversations are, because he's almost making it sound like those in a political climate who do theology, and especially political theology, are exclusively doing political theology in a scriptural vacuum, and they came up with bad ideas in the 16th and 17th century. And that's not necessarily the case. They were just, as Paul was when he was talking about slavery, writing in his context, and yet it was this godly, heavenly Christian ethic that was outside of that political climate and outside of the confines of the writings of the theologian in question that drove them and guided them with wisdom to speak in a way that could carry a message that transcends that political climate and can apply to future generations. I guess part of the reason that I'm doing this reaction video is to show, like, the criticisms that we have about this podcast, about what Dr. Arnn said and about maybe what DeYoung didn't say, comes back down to the fact that I need a hero. We need a formidable, respectable, reformed, and wise voice to offer a better option than Christian nationalism, because so many level-headed people can see that it doesn't really offer what we actually want, and that we're not necessarily exclusively concerned with the fact that this period of history was illegitimate. Of course, we can't say that that time in which this reformed scholasticism came to us was a completely illegitimate time. But it's the fact that we are living in a post-monarchical age, and it's actually the step to get back to Christendom that we're concerned about. At what cost do you want to go back to this hierarchical model?
That gives rise to a you've written a lot about morality, about family,
Yep.
about sex, about how should a Christian live on the moral level? How should anyone live that way? And are those things different?
Yeah, that's a really good question because, as you know, one of the preeminent Enlightenment questions was the question of virtue. That's why Edwards has a whole treatise on virtue. Everybody's writing, Hutcheson's writing about virtue. They're writing about sensibility, about sympathy. They want to know, how do we live as good people? And can we do it? So I think a few different things. I think, yes, by common grace, people can live a decent moral life. At the same time, and I think this is consistent throughout the Christian tradition, certainly the Protestant tradition, that in order to do something truly good, it must be according to God's law, it must be from a heart of faith, and it must be for the right ends, it must have the right telos for God's glory. So are non-believers able to do good works in such a way that they fully pass muster with God? I would say no. And yet, we have a foundation, I think, in what God has revealed to us. You talk about natural law and commonplaces between Christians and non-Christians that we can pursue a kind of civic virtue. They really believed that a free people have to be a virtuous people, and that ergo they need to be a religious people, ergo we need Christianity. But in order to be a Christianity that leads to this kind of virtue, it can't be one that's by compulsion or by coercion. There is a difference between liberty and toleration, that those were not identical. So religious toleration is, we have an established church, we have a state religion, we will tolerate those who are dissenters. Liberty is a more expansive definition, and I, until you were reading it there again, I had forgotten that Washington makes that important connection.
Yeah, Hillsdale College is famous, which is a good thing, almost always.
Here's the clip.
But some mischievous journalist writes, but they are admired by the Christian nation. And it sort of, and I wrote a letter to the editor, and they printed it. I just said, somebody admiring somebody else doesn't necessarily say anything about somebody else.
That's right.
But if they do admire Hillsdale College, they will learn from it that a Christian nation is not possible because Jesus' kingdom is not of this world.
A Christian nation is not possible. Okay, first of all, on the face of it, he doesn't define what a Christian nation is, and then proceeds to say it's not possible. So, therefore, the Christian nationalist types, what they haven't really defined and gone after, will take that and say, well, do you believe in Christian families? Do you believe in Christian schools? Do you believe in a Christian marriage? Is there such thing as a Christian band? Yeah, you can have Christian things, so why can't you have a nation that identifies as Christian? See, it's one thing to say, which is half the debate, was America in its founding, in terms of its founding, is America a Christian nation? That's one side of the debate. To say that, he didn't say America is not a Christian nation. He didn't even say that America being considered as a Christian nation isn't possible because of this or that historical fact or whatever part of the experiment. He said a Christian nation is not possible. Right? So what are you, because we live in a fallen world, or what? What's the reason? He said, because Jesus' kingdom is not of this world. Well, already this is just ripe for Christian nationalists to get on board and say a Christian nation is not possible. A Christian nation, a nation being considered Christian, because on the basis of this fact that Jesus' kingdom is not of this world. Well, who said that a Christian nation, unless you're like a weird theonomist or whatever, is identical to Jesus' kingdom? Even Hitler hated Christ got on here and said, dumb and wrong. DeYoung said, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And like, okay, well, just respond to that then. Just what about this verse? What about this verse? You know what I mean? DeYoung, here's your L. See? A Christian college is not possible because Jesus' kingdom is not of this world. Hillsdale is a small Christian classical liberal arts college. I appear to have made some people mad by saying a Christian nation is impossible. Let me propose another formulation that I've often used for years. America is the most Christian nation because it recognizes the principle of religious liberty. That's what I said earlier. That seems like what he... Okay, so I wasn't wrong to say Christian nation, and then he said Christian politics. And then when he defined Christian politics earlier, he says, well, it's because of the principle of religious liberty. So is that the only thing that sets it apart as a Christian nation? You know what I mean? Is religious liberty? Is there a sense in which Christian ethics hold accountable a people? That the law of God holds a people accountable? which comes from the mouths of the founders and of Jesus himself when he says that his kingdom is not of this world. At Hillsdale, we believe that Jesus is the maker and savior of all. We also believe that the founders, that no law is good that compels anyone to believe that. Laws that compel belief are what led centuries of religious persecution and warfare in so-called Christian Europe. And I actually don't disagree that America is the most Christian nation because it recognizes the principle of religious liberty. I do think that that's a huge, huge factor. I just don't think it's the only thing. And I'm just saying, we need a hero. We need someone who's going to be robust and properly caveated in order to deal with all these moving parts.
How do you make? I'm not supposed to ask a question, but I'm genuinely curious because I think I agree with that, and at the same time, I think it's maybe more so in the 19th century after the awakenings, the Second Great Awakening, many people would have used the language of a Christian nation.
It is so frustrating that it gets clipped out, and it looks like Kevin DeYoung is in agreement, and he's not. And it clips, and it goes viral, and it's like, I need a hero. And DeYoung is like, getting, like, it's a bad look. It's a bad look. A Christian nation is not possible. Clip. Well, hold on. I just want to ask. I think I agree with you, but he pushes back. Why didn't you show that part?
The teaching of the Christian faith by precept and example shall remain a conspicuous aim of the college.
Good word, conspicuous.
Yeah, that's it.
So he brought it up. Listen, people. If you're going to take screenshots of stuff like, oh, you're a Christian. He says it in the interview. Just watch the thing.
You know it's bad when he has to say, I'm a Christian.
That's what yeah. So, I don't know.
No one can rule another in the name of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And Jesus does not himself authorize that. Now, in a church, which is a different thing, then sure enough, you want to be in the church, better listen to the pastor. There are elders. Your church is named for the word for elder.
That's right.
I mean, they go on, and DeYoung talks about the parable, and it's fine. It's fine. It's fine. It's not great. It's not terrible. It is what it is. Some voices, and even some from Hillsdale, have been spearheading the importance of structure and order in an orderless and structureless, godless world. And that is what I think should be at the forefront of some who are wanting to provide a better option than what Christian nationalism offers. And the point of contention does not need to be a tiptoeing delegitimization of the time from which Reformed theology has come to us. And that time was hierarchical. We don't need to delegitimize that time or almost delegitimize it, but what we need to do is ask ourselves whether or not the cost upon certain generations, maybe one or more, is worth it in order to get back to that. Since, and I've said this before, it's kind of off topic, it's more along ethnic lines, but monoculture is not inherently sinful, and diverse culture is not inherently sinful in and of themselves. That's not the problem. The problem is the cost to get whatever version of society or culture worth it? But I wonder if it's sometimes out of fear that the argument of generational cost won't be effective enough as saying, oh, well, it's just simply not possible. I mean, it is possible. It is possible. and that's not a good enough argument. And so when you hear someone on the new right say, well, we need to tear down and rebuild, it's easy to look at that and say, well, that's just woke right. Because the left wants to tear down and they want to tear down the structure as it is. But there are ways in which, yes, the right does want to do that, but it's not identical to the left, because while it might have striking similarities to the leftist tactics, the desired end goal is not the same as the left. The left wants a purely egalitarian, completely anti-traditional, and in most ways anti-Christian values, and that's not what the right wants. The right does want authority, but they want to tear down the structures in order to get there. And so
and they would consider it traditional. They're going back to an even older.
they're going back to old conservatism, but the means by which we have to get there, many are concerned, how do you achieve that without violence? What is a Christian nation? I don't know. Okay? I don't know. I believe in it, and I want it. This made me feel seen. Great question. Still waiting for a lucid and biblical answer to this question. I've struggled with because I was in a band, and that quip of, well, we're not a Christian band, but we're Christians in a band that make up a band, so we're a band of Christians. So it's like, well, can you have a Christian nation? And Dr. Arnn is like, no, but we're a nation of Christians. I think America is one. I think that at its founding, I think you could say it's a Christian nation. I don't have a problem saying that. I'm against Christian nationalism, but not the idea that that America is a Christian nation. I want to do more thinking about that. Here's what we can do for sure, and that is be rigorously committed to total depravity. I'm going to chalk this up to providence and just say that I have, by God's providence, been reading a lot of Calvin this week, almost out of need. Like, I went back to Calvin to see what it was like reading him in light of all the Catholic stuff I have to think through, and EO, and why am I an evangelical, why am I a Reformed Protestant. And most people say that the heart of Calvin's theology is predestination, and I'm not going to argue with that because I'm not a Calvin scholar, but I am going to say that what I remember and what I went back and confirmed the other day is that a huge thread in Calvin's system of thought is total depravity, which necessitates sovereign grace. So if we really are broken and totally depraved sinners, then we need to have sovereign grace act upon us and save us and bring us to life in Christ. And so we have to, my recommendation is that, stick with me here, but actually, if we want to do better politics, be rigorously Calvinistic. I'm not all that in a bag of chips. I'm all nothing in a bag of worms. And I believe that the more that all of us do this, are rigorously Reformed and aggressively Protestant and Baptist and committed to Reformed spirituality, reading the Valley of Vision every day, bringing it to work, praying it on our lunch break, let's contribute to the cultural mood. And that is that we are sinners in need of saving grace. And those sinners, those are the ones running our government. And so that's what I mean when I say take that stone of Calvinism to kill those two birds with. That is ourselves and our own spiritual malaise, and spearheading evangelism and basically what I'm saying is influencing the mission of the church that way. And then I bet that's going to affect our political theology as well. So we need to stay Calvinist. We need to stay engaged in this conversation, continuing to define what a Christian nation is. Really, all I'm saying is, no matter what we do, no matter how we define this, no matter what this means for us, we have got to stay Baptist, my friends.